Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a gigantic college football slate. I've gone through and I've picked out about 6 or 7 players at each position, actually a few more wide receivers, though. But I've got a bunch of guys that are pretty high price, and then we got a big chunk of guys that are cheaper. I'm trying to get a lot, kind of a variance, but for each position. So, with that said, let's get into it. Before I do that, though, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? Helps quite a bit. So first for quarterbacks, we've got C.J. Stroud here for Ohio State. Now, he had a rough week last week, but he's got an easier opponent this week against Indiana, and I expect him to have a really good game here. Indiana's got a really subpar defense, and I expect him to do well. Then we're going to look at Dylan Gabriel for Oklahoma. He's another guy that's facing a pretty bad defense, the 178th defense here. He's been a bit inconsistent this season, but he has big game potential. He can throw 400 yards in a game. And in this particular game, he should definitely have some opportunity to throw for a lot of yards. He does throw a bunch of attempts. The only real glitch with him is sometimes his percentage isn't particularly great. But he does throw touchdowns, and he gets fancy points, and his price point's pretty fair on this particular slate. Though a better option at the similar price point is Hendon Hooker, who's going against Missouri. Now he had a rough week against Georgia, but I feel like everybody does. It was a good bounce back game for him. He should score a pretty good chunk of points in this one, and his price point's pretty fair. For a value play here, we have J.J. McCarthy for Michigan against Nebraska. Now, as we see that defense is not very good for Nebraska, and so we should look for him to throw the ball a little bit more, hopefully, in this one. And he's been pretty good to get 15 to 20 fantasy points, but he's had a few off games. He's not a perfect quarterback by any stretch of imagination, but he's had some really good weeks, and I expect him to have a good week this week. Then we're going to look at KJ Jefferson for Arkansas. Now, he's got up against a tough defense with LSU, but he has basically been matchup proof with the exception of Alabama this season. He's also a running quarterback, so that gives him a lot of upside. He's also pretty cheap this week compared to most of the other guys on the slate, and so I think he's a great option, especially in the flex position, because he can make a lot of things happen, even if even if the scoring, even if the game is tight, he manages to do a lot. Arkansas's defense, unfortunately, isn't very good, so they end up playing from behind a lot. But overall, he's a great quarterback, and so he's a fun quarterback, and he scores a decent chunk of fantasy points. Then we're going to look at Tanner Mordoxi for SMU. Now, his price point has come up a lot, but he has massive potential in this game. This is the highest scoring game on the slate. Between SMU and USF, and his team is favored to win. Last week, he actually threw 9 touchdowns. Now, I don't expect that, but I do think a 3 or 4 touchdown day is possible with him, and he's probably my favorite play at quarterback. I mean, yeah, there's a little bit of a bias because of his insane 9 touchdown game, but this week is also he's the highest scoring team on the week, and so he has a lot of upside as a result. He can also throw for a ton of yards. So then we're going to get running backs, and we're going to start with Blake Corum here from Michigan. He is the #1 back for them. He's been rushing quite a few times each game, and he's been over 100 yards in all but the first 3 games of the season. If we look at his stats, he's hit number 25 fantasy points almost every game, exception of the first 2. I really do like him this week. Obviously, he's pretty expensive, but he is a great play on this particular slate against a weak opponent. Chase Brown here is another guy that's the lead back for Illinois. Now he gets a lot of rush attempts, and he's getting a lot of yards as well. But he hasn't gotten as many touchdowns as some of the other guys. But he's actually not had a single game under 100 yards, and so despite the touchdowns, he's still scoring 25 fantasy points a game. And I really think he's in a great spot here against Purdue. Then we're going to look at Jabari Small for Tennessee against Missouri. Now, Missouri does have a pretty good run defense, but even against some other teams that had good run defenses, he was really good, including Kentucky. where he scored 17.5 fantasy points. And he has opportunity to have another game like that. He's a little bit cheaper, so he's got some risk, but he still has some upside in this game. Then we're going to look at Josh Williams for LSU. His price point is really cheap. Now, he doesn't get the rush attempts, but he does get some receptions through the air, and he does get some touchdowns in the games where he's been featured some. So I do think he's a good play on this particular slate. Just a little bit risky, but overall he seems pretty solid for LSU and this tough matchup for them against Arkansas. Now Arkansas doesn't really do very well against the run. Then we're going to look at Mayan Williams for Ohio State. Now, Mayan Williams is their lead back here. He should be the top guy, and he gets a pretty good amount of rushes. Not as many as some of the other star backs, but he still has a lot of upside. He's been inconsistent this season, but if he can score the touchdowns, he'll be able to pay off here pretty well. Then we're going to look at Nicholas Singleton here for Penn State. Now he's another guy that's the lead back. He actually does get about 15 rushes a game, and he's been scoring some decent amount of touchdowns so far. He has been a little bit inconsistent as well, but that's part of the reason he's cheaper. But he's got a nice matchup today, and I expect him to have a good day. Then we're going to look at Raheem Sanders for Arkansas. LSU's run defense has not been ideal, and of course, Arkansas hits you with a 1-2 punch with their running back and quarterback being able to run the ball. Sanders had a rough week last week, surprisingly, but I look for him to bounce back. He's been really good all season long. His only real bad game was against Texas A&M. He's had good games against Alabama and South Carolina, also BYU and Auburn. So I expect him to have a good day here against LSU. And he's a real fun player to watch too. If you haven't watched him, he can get yards in bunches, and you can see he's got 150-yard games all over the place. So for his price point, he's pretty fair, though it has come up a little bit. In the wide receiver situations, we got Cedric Tillman first for Tennessee against Missouri. Hooker, for him to have a good day, he's going to have to find him in this game, and I expect him to do that. He has a lot of upside in this matchup, and especially at his price point. Emeka Egbuka for Ohio State. Now, he's the second guy on the list for Ohio State when it comes to wide receivers. He's not the number one guy, but which is Harrison, but he still has scored in bunches this season, and he should have plenty of opportunities in this one, much more than he did last week. So I expect him to have a big game in this particular matchup. And then Isaiah Williams for Illinois. He's another guy in a pretty good position offensively against the defense. He's had a couple inconsistent games this season, but overall he gets a pretty good amount of targets, and so if he can pull him for the receptions and get a couple touchdowns, he would definitely pay off on this particular slate. Jakari Brooks here. Brooks for Alabama. Sorry, it's actually Jakari Brooks. I wrote Jakari for some reason. Anyhow, he's $6,300. He's one of the top wide receivers rather for Alabama. He's been somewhat inconsistent this season, but he's starting to get it together as of late, and I think he's in a really good spot to have a good game here against Mississippi. Then we're going to look at Hyatt for Tennessee. Now, he's the second wide receiver for Tennessee, but he gets a lot of yards as well. He doesn't get as many targets, but he's still getting lots of yards, and he's been absolutely crazy when it's to touchdowns. So he's definitely a red zone a guy for this team, and I expect him to have a massive game today against Missouri, who, while they are decently good defensively, Tennessee should be able to take care of them. Javon Baker for UCF. Now, he's the transfer kid from Alabama to UCF. He's got a lot of potential. He's had a couple weeks where he hasn't gotten as many targets, but he should get plenty of targets in this one. This is a high-scoring game, and so I expect him to play well. Then we're going to look at Luke. Oops, sorry about that. Luke Shoemaker for Michigan. Now his price is really cheap, but he's the tight end here for them, and he's been actually getting No, I don't think he's. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong player. He's really cheap. He's not the tight end. The tight end's another guy. Anyhow, he's been playing pretty well. He gets around 10 targets a game. Some games, at least the last 5 weeks. I expect him to get that today here against Nebraska, who's not very good. And oh yeah, he is a tight end. I don't know why I'm saying he's not. Sorry about that, guys. Anyhow, uh, he is getting about 10 targets a week. He's a good safety valve for Michigan, and I expect him to have a really solid game. He's also a good value play at his price point, and so I do like him this week. Then we're looking at Marvin Harrison Jr. for Ohio State. Obviously, he's one of the top wide receivers in the country. Now, he's been a little bit inconsistent when it comes to scoring, having big games, but he does have big games in bunches, and if he has, over 100 yards, he'll likely have a couple touchdowns in this one against a subpar defense. Then we're going to Mayer for Notre Dame. Now he's also a tight end for them, and he's $6,800. He's been pretty consistent this season. He's had a couple low-scoring games, but he has touchdown potential in this one, and I do like him against Navy here. Then we're going to look at Tinsley for Penn State. He's another guy that kind of doesn't get enough recognition, but he does get 7 to 10 targets, and he's been pretty decent when it comes to scoring this season. I don't expect him to really score 30 fantasy points, but I do think he can get 15 to 20 in this matchup. Then we're going to look at Rashee Rice for SMU. Now he's got a nice upside game here. He gets a ton of targets in most games, and I expect him to have a really big game here. He can score touchdowns in bunches. He can score yards in bunches. So I expect a high-scoring game out of him, especially in the highest slate of the day when it comes to actual points and on the team with the most points. And then Xavier Weaver finally for South Florida. He's been getting 7 to 10 targets each game the last 5 or 6 games, and I expect him to continue that and score points in bunches. He's a little bit too cheap for his potential and production, so I do like him a lot on the slate. With that said, guys, thank you all for liking, commenting, and subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day, guys.